Dear friends of the Kreisky Forum, welcome to the Kreisky Forum, welcome to Philoxenia on this very nice late summer day here in Vienna. A special thanks to our special guest, Gideon. I hope we did not interrupt your mourning period for your queen.
Yes, well, no, it's fine, thanks.
Very, very special moment, of course, for people who live in London like us.
Yeah.
Given the fact that even if you're not a fierce royalist, the whole city is somehow affected by her passing, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, it'll be interesting. I mean, the body is still up in Scotland, as you know. When it comes down to Lion State in London, will be quite a moment, I think.
Will be a total close down of the entire situation, our whole city. But this is not the reason why we are here to talk about the Queen. We are invited Gideon Rachman to come here today because his latest book is just been published in German, and we will talk about it. Gideon Rachman, as many of you know, of course, is the chief world politics commentator of the Financial Times since 2006, and a lot of what you experienced also as a roving reporter for the FT, we find also in the book. One of the great perks of being a journalist working for a global newspaper is that everyone you meet everywhere between London and Beijing can read you, knows who you are, which of course comes with a lot of responsibility. I hope we will discuss this a little bit later. Gideon wrote other books before that who have also been published in German in the same publishing house like this one. So in German, your newest book, Strongmen, has been translated to Welt der Autokraten. And I had a little conversation with your publisher today because I wrote in Falter in the introduction to the interview that we did in preparation to this talk. I said the German title is a little less spicy than the English one, and he said, so what would you have done? And I said, maybe keep Strongman, as in German also. And he said like it didn't feel like it would sit well with the German readership, so it's Welt der Autokraten. And we have some of the copies also here, so after the talk you can buy the book, and Gideon will be so nice to sign it, I hope. You have, before you went to the FT, you already worked for 15 years as a correspondent in various places for the Economist. One of the places was Brussels, where we actually met first time as correspondents there, and I remember you were a rather Eurosceptic British journalist, and I think what happened later was that Brexit turned you into a pro-European Brit, mourning the exit from the European Union, that your country was sort of thrown into a populist surge. We'll also talk about the little British excursion into populism and what that meant in strongman terms in the recent years. But you live in London mostly. You have been given plenty of international and local prizes, the Orwell Prize for Political Journalism, the Commentator Award at the European Press Prize. This is certainly not the last time, and the list will grow over the years, because this book now also, Strongmen, has been already very well reviewed all over the English-speaking press. We hope it will also reach the German readers with this publication. And so I'm very happy that we are meeting here tonight to go through a little bit of what this is about. Welcome again.
Thank you, Tessa. Thanks for having me.
What you wrote about is a very specific phenomenon. If you look at strongmen, what strongmen are and how it came about, it's something that we have now in 2022. We are already completely used to it. But what you describe here is how Vladimir Putin in Russia became sort of the archetype of the strongman, and how we, for a long time in the West and also in the East, didn't necessarily see it coming. So let's talk about this the archetype, about Putin and how this whole phenomenon came about. Because what did you see was the important turning point, how Putin changed from someone that also in the West people put some hope into, and then suddenly we got the feeling it turned sour, this relationship with him.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that it's kind of in retrospect clear that Putin was the beginning of this age of the strongman, but it certainly didn't seem like that at the time. Or rather, I think the West was so confident after the ideological and geopolitical victory at the end of the Cold War, and you've got to remember Putin comes to power only 11 years after that, that we found it almost very hard to conceive of the idea that you might have a return of strongman authoritarianism. And Putin is the beginning of a pattern where we have a number of these leaders, Putin and I'd say Erdogan as well in Turkey, Xi Jinping in China, who come in, and their initial reception in the West is that they're greeted, and Modi in India actually, as liberal reformers really. That people don't understand what they are or what they're about to become. And I think that's partly because of as I say, overconfidence in the West, a sense that we now know that that kind of leadership is a political and ideological dead end, and that therefore, obviously, if this person seems reasonably modern and intelligent, they'll follow a kind of liberal democratic path, ultimately. And so when Putin comes in 2000, actually, symbolically enough, New Year's Eve, 1999 is when he takes power, he speaks the language of democracy, actually, a bit. You know, he says that, you know, how proud he is that Russia's had a fully democratic election. And when Clinton meets him, he says this is the guy who will complete the modernization and democratization of Russia. In fact, as you'll know, I think you were living in Russia some of that time, a little bit later. If you wanted to see them, the signs that this were very clear quite early, that this was not what was happening. You know, he relaunches the Chechen War. Some of the more troublesome oligarchs are thrown out of the country really quite quickly.
Control of the media.
Control of the media happens really within a year. But we don't really want to see it. And Putin continues to speak the language of sort of liberal democracy for a while. And then I think there's a break point in 2007, and Ivan Krastev, who's sitting in the audience, written about that yourself, the Munich speech that he gives, where he sort of ends the idea that actually the West and the Soviet Union, or former Soviet Union, are agreed that the end of the Cold War was kind of happy ending, and it takes a much more sort of anti-Western line, which really culminates with the invasion of Ukraine, but you have Georgia, Crimea, etc., etc. And as I say, this pattern of Western misreading of strongman rulers happens again with Erdogan. He comes to power in 2003. For a long time, people in the West, particularly in the US, wanted to believe that he's this guy who's going to reconcile Islam and democracy. It's the height of the Iraq War. We're looking for liberal Muslim leaders, and he seems to be the guy. And apparently Obama spoke to him more than any other leader in his first term in office, than any other foreign leader. Obama chooses to make his first speech overseas in Turkey because this guy seems to be so important. And again, he disappoints. He becomes increasingly autocratic and goes on much more sort of anti-Western slant as well. And we could, similar reasons actually to Putin. I think he begins to feel insecure about his own domestic situation, to believe that the West is plotting against him, all of that. And finally, Xi Jinping, same thing, comes to power in 2012. I remember meeting him in 2013 with a group of kind of Western, some of them ex-political leaders, some of them kind of intellectuals. And a lot of the people in the group were sort of bought the idea that the main thing to understand about Xi Jinping was that he was an economic reformer, that he was going to complete China's transition to the market, and there were a few in the group and others who wrote stuff later saying, and actually maybe he'll democratize a bit, you know, and create independent courts. Complete misreading. He too actually centralizes power, imprisons over 1 million people in an anti-corruption drive, becomes much more anti-Western. So it took a very long time for us to realize what was happening. And I suppose the trigger for me to write the book was when this phenomenon actually breaks out and takes over the United States briefly with the election of Trump. And we can talk about whether it's fair to put Trump in the same basket as these leaders. I think actually it is. And so at that point, you realize that strongman leadership is not confined to fragile democracies or countries that have never been a democracy, such as China, but has actually made into the heartlands of the Western political system.
I mean, let's take it a little bit apart. Maybe one thing that comes to my mind is to ask you if you think that, you know, these leaders came to power and they were different then than they are now. If you look at Putin, for example, he's maybe the best example of someone who basically would have had the chance to go a different way. Or do you think that no, it was sort of from the beginning something that needed to go wrong?
I think that, you know, the longer you're in power, the more likely you are to go slightly mad in power. I mean, I think if you're something like a sort of absolute ruler in Russia and centralize power more and more around you, then you're bound to sort of slightly lose touch with reality. But I think that there's also one of the things about strongman rule, and I mean, it's a slightly loose term, but one of the things about it is that it involves breaking the law, essentially, that you elevate the importance of the judgment of the ruler and the needs of the ruler above the system. That's sort of a key to the idea that the individual and his wisdom and needs matter more than institutions. And once you go down that path of breaking the law, it actually becomes very dangerous to leave power. So that, again, you know Russia well. I mean, the number of, you know, the blood that's probably on Putin's hands, the things that could be investigated, or the money that's been stolen, and it's not just him, people around him who are implicated in the system. If Putin were to be replaced or to lose power, you know, his personal fate would be potentially, you know, he could be put on trial, but also a lot of rich people and powerful people would be at risk. So I think it's sort of inherent in the strongman leader that you end up becoming more and more autocratic because you can't, it becomes more and more dangerous to tolerate challenges to your leadership. And you could see the same, you know, with Xi in China, all those people who've been sent to prison and so on, well, you know, they might come out of prison perhaps, or their families might take revenge on you. So it becomes difficult.
No, for sure, at the end there's no exit strategy because, as you say, it endangers sort of the entire group of cronies that is in the kleptocracy together. Absolutely. And you can't leave. But if you look at the sort of what defines strongmen rule, that you define it in your book, the common traits would be to rule by politics by fear, by the contempt for law, by a personality cult, and by the claim to represent the real people, which is sort of something that resonates in German lands, of course, particularly well also. So that is basically sort of the pre-stage of fascism, which we see in Russia at the moment with the emergence of the term racism, coming from Brasilia, from Russia, in a particular drastic case. So would you say that it is necessarily something that develops out of a strongman rule, which can come in, as you said, various ways, can be more or less democratic and more or less autocratic? Does it necessarily lead to fascism in the end?
Well, you say fascism is it's a term people might define differently, but I think it's inherently anti-democratic, put it that way. And yeah, I think that the personality cult aspect is something that's closely associated with fascism. But I think that one of the reasons the personality cult is particularly important, we talked about it a bit, is that it's associated, one of the reasons you justify putting all your faith in an individual, or that this kind of politics asks you to do that, is that they will usually evoke some kind of national crisis. They'll say that the nation is either under siege, either domestically from, in the United States, I suppose the Trumpians would say the woke left, or by immigrants or something, and they're overwhelming the country, or perhaps simultaneously, the country is under assault overseas, that, say, as Orban said in Hungary, that migrants are flooding into the country, or Putin in Russia, that NATO is trying to destroy the country. And if you have this combination of domestic and international threats, and you say, I'm the only guy who understands this, you must put your faith in me, because, and really you can't afford to operate under the traditional rules, because that's what's led us to this terrible crisis. But as Trump put it, I alone can fix it. And once you say, I alone can fix it, then you open the door to saying, well, we're in this emergency, I alone can fix it, and therefore anything is justified in terms of breaking the rules, arresting the people who are, perhaps causing the crisis or going to war, as Putin has done. So it's the combination of the evocation of a sense of crisis and the personality cult leads you towards illiberalism and something often close to fascism, yeah.
I mean, we have, of course, the feeling in the West was always that strongman rule is something for weak democracies or countries that don't have a very strong, long tradition in democracy. Of course, we in Austria and in Germany, we know very well that so-called civilized cultures can descend very quickly into the worst type of dictatorships and murderous regimes. But that was sort of the common idea here, that we looked at Putin, who had sort of the choice to become a democratic leader or not, and saw him descending into now being the butcher of Moscow. But with a different type of regime like in China, where democracy, of course, was never introduced. So how does that development, you open the chapter with China with your description, what you also now described, the scene, how this group of influential Western journalists and also academics, business people, wild mix, arrived there and then discussed, so who is this Xi Jinping? What will he mean? Will he be like his predecessor, or will he, and nobody understood that he might actually be closer to Mao in the end, in his attempt to take whole power and keep it also for himself personally, with all mistakes that go with it. So how does a non-democratic authoritarian ruler,
how does it fit into the whole strongman?
How does it fit into the strongman thing? Because it comes from the opposite direction.
Yeah, well, look, I think that, in a Chinese context, it does actually make sense, because after Mao, I think a lot of the Chinese elite realized that one of the things that had gone horribly wrong was that you had this personality cult, this man who'd had far too much power, created, tragedies, the Cultural Revolution, Great Leap Forward. And so the Communist Party attempted to move towards a more collective style of leadership. And if you think about the immediate predecessor of Xi Jinping, he was a guy called Hu Jintao, who was very colorless, was served just the 2 terms in office, and they put one of the first things that Deng Xiaoping does in the early 80s when he takes power is to put term limits into the General Secretary of the Communist Party and the presidency of China, which are the 2 key posts along with the head of the military, precisely so that you can't go back to having a strongman ruler. And so they try to, they're not going to move towards a democracy, but they are going to try to move towards a more collective, institutionalized leadership. And for a while, it seems to work. So Deng leaves, and then you have Jiang Zemin, who serves just the 2 terms, Hu Jintao, who serves just the 2 terms. But then Xi Jinping comes in, and he clearly has some aspirations to recreate the cult around Mao. He incorporates his thought into the Chinese constitution, or the constitution of the Chinese Communist Party, which only Mao had done beforehand. He does, you know, he's a rather megalomaniacal character. He centralizes power, and I happen to be in China again at the time of this crucial party convention when Xi's thought is both written into the constitution and they abolish the term limits to allow him to just rule forever, essentially. And I remember he gave this like 3-hour speech to the party congress. Fine, people sometimes do that, but
3 hours is a bit long.
But I was talking to academic friends of mine, and they had all been ordered to watch the speech, to assemble in the faculty room and watch the speech. And one of them wasn't there, and he got a call from the party saying, "Where are you?
No.
And we want you to, you know, send us evidence of yourself. Take us a selfie of yourself watching the speech and send it to us." You know, it's that bad. And similarly, you know, then a couple of years later, I was back in Shanghai, and all the party members have to have the Xi Jinping Thought app on their phone. And I said to this friend of mine, "You don't seriously like spend your time studying this?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, I've got the app." And he opened it and he said, "Oh, God, it shows I haven't looked at it today." You know, because the amount of time you're studying is checked. So it's a real crazy personality cult which has been installed there. And we're entering a crucial month where next month, actually, October,
yeah,
the party convention happens. And even though things are not going that well in China at the moment, zero COVID isn't working, the economy is slowing, it looks like he will get his 3rd term. And then as some Chinese friend put it to me, he said, "Well, I can accept the 3rd term, it's the 4th term I'm worried about." But, you know, which I think is pretty inevitable.
Well, he definitely is aiming for lifelong leader now by
Totally, yeah.
this point, right? But the biggest surprise maybe in strongman rule that came over us was when Donald Trump won the American elections, became president, and proved us all wrong with the feeling, okay, in a democratic society, these things don't happen so easily. And then it also hit sort of the center of Western power. Even at the beginning when he came in, people were thinking, so maybe he will get some good advisors who can think from A to B or something, and it would not be so bad. So at the end of his first and hopefully only term, he sent the mob to storm Congress and to storm Capitol Hill and sit in the center of power. So we came very close to a very, very serious situation there. So how did that happen, and what needs to happen in a democracy that the institutions that are functioning still allow enough people to vote for a man like this, who then also completely unhinges while he's in office, and nobody can stop him at that point, except fortunately with a very not too large of a vote, a 2nd term is being introduced.
Well, I mean, I think that's a question that historians will be, you know, I think in 100 years' time, if people are still sitting history exams, they'll be writing answers to how did Donald Trump come to power, because it's a huge question. But I think that one thing that you can say is that, you know, I'm not a huge fan of Trump, as you might guess, but he was in some ways a brilliant, intuitive politician, because he understood something about where American voters were and the things you could say and prosper from that the ordinary Republicans did not. And so that, you know, we all will remember many moments when Trump did something and you would say, "Oh, well, that's over, you can't do that." I mean, I remember the first time I thought that was when he was on a TV show and he said that John McCain was not a war hero because he'd been captured. And I thought, that's crazy. The American, it's so obviously hypocritical. Here's this guy who dodged the draft in Vietnam, and America's a super patriotic country, and the Republicans above all, he's finished. Absolutely not. And then like 100 different things like that, from abusive comments about women. There's so many that one forgets them all. But I mean, another one that sticks in my head, but it's just a tiny detail, was when Judge Scalia died. And obviously, as we now know, packing the Supreme Court was really key to the project. And Trump said, "Oh well, a lot of people are saying he was murdered." What? And this guy, he's running for president, but it goes on, and on and on. And so he, as he famously says, I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and people would still vote for me, and he's probably right. So he realized that there was something he was doing that was appealing, and I think part of the taboo smashing was actually part of the appeal, that it was a way of saying, I'm not the ordinary elite, I'm this guy who'll do something completely different. That also his language about emergency, we talked about that earlier, resonated with a lot of people. There'd been an economic crisis, but also I think that the demographic changes in America were which are still ongoing, were very threatening to people. That people, the census now projects that America will be majority minority, in other words, less than 50% white by 2044, I think. Given America's racial history, the Civil War, etc., a lot of people, you combine that with economic insecurity, were waiting for a figure like Trump. And you mentioned Germany's own experience. I remember reading some historian saying of Hitler that it's not, what was frightening was not that he was who he was, but there were so many people waiting for somebody like him. And I think that is true of Trump as well.
But I mean, at the time we were thinking, writing, commenting on the question if the election of Donald Trump was sort of the last battle cry of the angry white man. How do you judge the situation now with these recent discoveries of him having hoarded or also misplaced in his basement classified documents? Will that end him? Is there a possibility that he will not be even able to, continue to have such a considerable influence on the Republican Party?
Well, it might, but I think that people have been predicting the end of Donald Trump for a long time, and they've been proven wrong many, many times. And actually, one of the reasons that he hasn't been ended is that he continues to have enormous influence over the core of the Republican Party, so that you saw after January the 6th, a lot of people like McConnell and Senator Lindsey Graham and so on, distancing themselves very rapidly from Trump and saying, no, that's unacceptable. And then they discover that Republican voters are still largely behind him, and they all fall back in line. It's possible that even though, so I think if he runs for the Republican nomination, he'll get it. Probably, even with all this stuff, because as I say, this is just another example of what we were talking about, where we say, oh, that's outrageous, obviously that finishes him, but it never does. So I think he'll probably get the Republican nomination. It may be that his behavior and so on, and if say the Ukraine war turns into a triumph for the West, that could help Biden. That although he still has a grip on the Republican Party, that he doesn't win the election, but who knows? The economy is also in terrible shape. And then, of course, as you know, there's these questions about Republican parties at state level taking over key positions and possibly mounting a challenge to the election next time that actually works, or at least throws it into doubt.
Yeah, well, the ousting of Liz Cheney last 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, was actually quite concerning to think that even among, that this strategy works to put Trumpist candidates through, and even with sort of the Republican aristocracy, like the Cheneys, where what dead Cheney was a little bit astonished at.
Oh, absolutely.
What happened.
And I mean, I think that the person who beat Liz Cheney was somebody who had originally said, obviously, the whole January the 6th thing was an outrage, and obviously the election wasn't rigged, and then found that to win, she had to recant that and say the election was rigged.
I mean, what could happen also is that Donald Trump does not get the nomination, but that who gets the nomination might be even worse, because that's also one of the unfortunate consequences of strongmen. The strongman phenomenon is that who replaces them, who comes afterwards, might be even more dangerous, more unhinged, maybe younger and fresher and longer in the game.
Well, this is a debate that, you know, a lot of people are looking at this guy Ron DeSantis in Florida, and there are those who say he'll be worse because he's smarter, etc. Personally, I mean, I don't know if this is optimism. I think that Trump is uniquely unhinged. I don't, you know, he's got sort of peculiar qualities, and so I think more or less any other Republican would be at least outwardly more respectful of institutions. And it's very interesting. I mean, talking to or even reading the accounts of people who worked with Trump. In other words, they were sufficiently on board with the project to actually take a job in the White House. How they felt that he was instinctively an authoritarian in the way that the people he interacted with, the people he got on with, he had great meetings with Orban. He had great meetings with Erdogan. In fact, he says to Bob Woodward, "The tougher and meaner they are, the better I like them." He you know, calls Xi Jinping a genius. He calls Putin a genius just before the invasion of Ukraine. And the people he really hates are people like Angela Merkel, Theresa May, women, and sort of Democrats, basically.
I mean, that's the other thing, that maybe one of the weaknesses we'll see on the strongman era is that it's very difficult for strongmen who do like each other, but to actually strike an alliance, because they are so self-centered and nationalist usually that it's very difficult to build an alliance between different strongman countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those alliances are inherently unstable because they are based around, you know, one guy and another guy sort of striking a deal in a room. But I think that the most important strongman alliance at the moment is Putin and Xi, and that, if it holds, could change the world. And I think it's partly a common ideological thing that, and of course, I should back up a bit for those who didn't notice. Just 3 weeks before the war, Putin goes to Beijing. They sign a big sort of friendship agreement between the Chinese and the Russians, talking about unlimited partnership between Russia and China. And our friend Alex Gabuev, who's now had to leave Russia from the Carnegie Endowment, said that they got on with each other because they were, you know, in a way, the Tsar and the Emperor. They both were looking back to that. That's how they ran their countries. They saw themselves as the personification of their countries, the representative of their country's interests, with a perfect right to sit together one-to-one and to speak for Russia, speak for China, and do a deal. And I think the other thing is that she is strangely obsessed with the collapse of the Soviet Union because it was a fellow communist party. And one of the first things he does when he comes in is commission a film on the collapse of the Soviet Union and make all the party cadres watch it. And he says, you know, nobody was man enough to stand up when the moment came to say, no, we're not going to let this happen. And I think in that sense he admires Putin as somebody who is going to try and reverse all of this. Although sort of the Chinese will tell you that Putin didn't tell him what he was going to do, which I find plausible enough. You know, why would he tell him in detail?
Well, that's in any case also a mystery. We will hear about more once Putin has been put out of power, but however that ever will happen, how this decision about doing this war came about, since nobody really believed he would do that, except the CIA knew. Yeah,
they really did that. Actually, it's quite interesting. I mean, because for once, the CIA and MI6 really got it right. And I say for once because, of course, they got the Iraq war wrong, you know, the famous weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. And in fact, the CIA had not covered themselves in glory over Afghanistan, you know, where they had told Biden that the government would survive and that Taliban wouldn't sweep to power. But on this particular occasion, they really were correct. And but you mentioned it, it was interesting. I was in the Munich Security Conference like the weekend before the invasion, and all the sort of Western spies, who were quite in evidence, were wandering around saying, you know, that he's going to invade next week. And but there were top German diplomats and actually Ukrainians who were saying that's not going to happen. The most he'll do is he'll do something in the Donbass. Yeah.
We were all wrong.
Yeah.
But it's quite interesting to think that, as you said at the beginning, that the democratic age and the optimism we all felt after 1989 and the end of the Soviet Union, also in the freedom for Eastern European peoples and also for the Russians, it lasted only very briefly. And if we look at this tableau now of how the old, the big old powers, what leaders they have and what leaders the emerging powers have. So you have India with Modi and China with Xi sort of have turned sour in the sense that they have now also in India, which was much more, where the opportunities were bigger. And I think you were one of those who, as you self-critically remark in the book also, saw a chance for Modi to eventually be a reformer or have some good influence on the whole system. It's quite interesting that these emerging powers have these strongmen, while if you look, Trump at the moment was replaced by Biden, who actually does a better job than a lot of people have expected in terms of getting legislation through, calming sort of the international waves a little bit. And in Europe, the big powers are under, so far, relative, you know,
we don't really
moderate leadership in France and in Germany, at least. In Italy could go wrong. We should talk about the first strong woman in this club that might emerge soon. But so how do these emerging powers versus the old powers come into the whole balance?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, you know, if you just wanted to do a sort of global tour, basically the two most populous countries in the world, which is 40% of the world population, India and China, both have strongman leaders. And I just should briefly talk about Modi because India is so important. And, you know, I was talking to the leading Indian historian, Ram Guha, a couple of weeks ago, and he says India is now basically a 30% democracy, as he would say it. I mean, it's not nearly as oppressive as China, but the press, you know, to give you another indication, the World Press Freedom Index, India is now 150th of 190 countries. Not great, you know, for a country that we think of as the world's leading democracy. So he's really taken that place backwards, and he's also done it on the basis of ethnic division. Is really, really important to. He's very much a Hindu leader as much as an Indian leader. So that is a really serious and dangerous development, particularly because I think the West, because we're so preoccupied with this rivalry with China, or at least the US is, really doesn't want to acknowledge what's happening in India. It's just too difficult. But so if you have India and China, then you've got, you said exempted Europe, but if you include Russia and Turkey, you know, both of which in some ways are European powers, they are both in the grip of strongman leaders. If you go to Latin America, the two largest countries in Latin America, well, we'll see what happens to Bolsonaro. But for the moment, you have Bolsonaro and AMLO in Mexico, who I'd also put in that category. And you do have Orban within the EU, and I think we had our own sort of semi-strongman leader in the form of Boris Johnson. You could argue whether he fits the category or not, but I think in some ways he was quite associated with he was the sort of British Trump in a rather British way, but he was a populist. He was, and at times did flirt with strongman politics, particularly when he suspended Parliament, which was really quite a striking thing to do.
Well, the interesting thing about Johnson was maybe that he imploded before he could sort of really spread his wings as a strongman. He could have grown into a rather frightening politician if he wouldn't have imploded after.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately we never discover what he was capable of. And I don't think even he knew, you know, because he did have a liberal side to him, but he was a very cynical guy, and so I think he was always willing to give himself the benefit of the doubt, put it that way. You know, he'd do things if they were convenient for him, and as I say, proroguing Parliament was pretty extreme, kicking out some of the leading members of his own party, and other little things around the sort of edges. They were fiddling with the Electoral Commission, attacks on the Supreme Court, authorised to the press. It was not, the signs were not good.
Well, the contempt of the law was certainly something that he was.
And the whole anti-elite thing was very important. And indeed, he uses some Trumpian language, like talks about the deep state. Yeah. Although somebody pointed out to me that actually even Macron has talked about the deep state trying to frustrate him. So that's a bad thing, a bad piece of vocabulary that Donald Trump has popularized, which incidentally started in Turkey. It was the Turks were the first, I'm told, to really become preoccupied by the idea of a deep state frustrating governments.
But that's a very important point also. In Turkey, the army always plays a very big role in sort of takeover of power, and it's actually interesting because Erdogan is not an army general and came from a populist background. But the army always plays a big role. Where does it fit? Since the French Revolution, the question was, does the army come with the rebellion, go with the rebellion or not? So one thing that Trump, for example, never did is bring in the army with him on his side. They never sided with him.
No, and they probably wouldn't have. But you know, there are all these accounts now of what was happening in the last 2 or 3 weeks, where people on the White House were talking to the Joint Chiefs like every day to check what Trump might be doing and so on. But I think that, you know, it's interesting where the army, I think top American military officers probably do believe in the system and were fairly horrified by Trump. And the other thing is that the American military is a very multiracial institution, and they need racial harmony, really. So the kind of race baiting that Trump was doing was potentially pretty disruptive for them. On the other hand, I'd imagine that your average white American soldier would be core Trump voters. So it's hard to, and there were certainly ex-military people quite well represented on the people who stormed the Capitol. Yeah. So, you know, the danger is, I think, that if Trump comes in on a second term, is that he will try to get his people in all the top institutions, including the military. And he might, you know, he's commander-in-chief, he can appoint who he likes.
Yes, and I mean, we see it with the courts, since he packed successfully the Supreme Court with people who think like him. But Putin might be an interesting man also, a strong man, to see how the whole army thing works out for him, because now, of course, there's a tight control of the Siloviki, of the sort of power ministry man in every respect. But since the war goes so badly, as far as we can see, and this latest development with the Ukrainian army being able to take back cities in the whole oblast around Kharkiv, the hope could be that sort of this control over all the different sectors of army and intelligence services might not be as tight as we thought.
Yeah, although, I mean, you know, from what I hear, that obviously everyone's looking to see for signs of dissent within the Russian elite, and not many that people have spotted yet, but we'll see. I mean, because, as you say, the past week has been very, very bad for him. And it feels like his real power base is the intelligence services, not the military.
Yeah. Before we go to questions, please prepare them if you have them. Let's talk about why, my favorite question, why are most authoritarian leaders in this world men? Why are the strong men and not strong women?
Yeah, well, I think that actually gender is really important for a lot of these strong men. It's not a coincidence. If you look at the rhetoric of them, I mean, as I said, they like a rhetoric of crisis. And part of the crisis that a lot of these leaders speak about is a social crisis. The idea that traditional values are being undermined. And those traditional values are being undermined often by gay rights, or trans rights is the thing that currently the American right is obsessed by, or indeed just feminism. And a lot of the social changes on, say, gay marriage or even women's rights have happened within our lifetimes. So there will be people who are not comfortable with them, who they can appeal to. And so that, for example, as I say, it's quite interesting how these trends span the West and the East, and democracies and non-democracies, but this macho posturing is really key. You know, obviously Putin, the famous pictures of him bare-chested. Trump actually boasts about the size of his penis in a televised debate, if you remember. She has banned the portrayal of effeminate men on Chinese television. Modi, when he campaigns, they talk about his 64-inch chest, or is it 56-inch chest? And he's like an old guy. He's 69. He's not actually particularly macho, but this idea of him as a literal strongman is very important. And similarly, a lot of the kind of liberal politicians that they deride often actually do turn out to be women, you know, whether it's Merkel or Hillary Clinton. So I think that a sort of male backlash aspect of strongman rule is really quite important.
Well, we have two contenders now, women in democratic societies that can turn a little bit strong, womanish. One is Liz Truss, succeeding Boris Johnson. Do we see any potential there? She's a bit more organized than him.
I don't think so. I mean, I'm not saying that the Conservative Party is going to morph into a sort of particularly liberal party, but I just, maybe I'm, you know, haven't seen it yet, but I don't think so. I mean, she may not be a terribly good prime minister, but I don't think she's going to be, I don't think she's got that intrinsic authoritarianism in her, but we'll see. And the other is Giorgia Meloni in Italy, and that is interesting because the Italian right so far, the far right, has been pretty macho. I mean, Berlusconi, very much so. Salvini, the same. But she is, a woman leader of a party that is, I think the term they use, post-fascist. So we'll see how that works out. But obviously she's not in power yet, so we can't quite be sure.
But how dangerous would she be in power? I mean, the anti-European speeches, for example, are very dangerous, of course, in a time when we need European unity, not only because in general it's good to have a strong pro-European stance in the main capitals in Europe, but also because we need to be united in order to stand up in this winter of discontent against the aggression of Russia in the Ukraine. So how dangerous do you think would it be if she comes to power?
It depends what you mean by dangerous. I mean, I think you might decry some of her policies and say, look, I really wish she wasn't anti-EU, but that doesn't necessarily make her an authoritarian leader. But the question is whether, I mean, she has said, and she's put out statements in English saying, you know, we put fascism behind us, we're a post-fascist party, etc., etc. Do you believe her? I mean, we'll find out when she gets into power, I guess. Certainly, that roots of that party are in the, you know, the element of Italian society that continued to admire Mussolini, no doubt about that. But on the other hand, you know, even people I know who work for Draghi say that personally she's quite impressive and she's quite intelligent. They said she's a highly intelligent person leading a party full of mad people. So how that works out, we'll see.
But intelligence is that a general
I think
characteristic?
No, that's true. I mean, you can be intelligent and bad, but I think they meant intelligent in the sense of responsible, you know, Draghi could sit with her and have a conversation and didn't think I'm dealing with a dangerous madwoman. But as I say, people evolve in power, so we'll see.